Our tale begins in the late 1800s, a time when America was booming with industrial growth, and Chicago, the Windy City, was at its peak, preparing for the 1893 World's Fair, a celebration of innovation and progress. But amidst the grandeur and excitement, there lurked a man whose ambitions were far more nefarious than the bright future everyone else seemed to be building toward. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, into a strict Methodist family. His father was an alcoholic, and discipline in the Mudgett household was doled out with an iron hand. Herman was an odd boy, intelligent, yes, but darkly curious. As a small, shy boy, he became a target for cruel taunts and abuse. Local bullies took great delight in terrorizing him, with one particular incident standing out, a moment that would forever alter young Herman's psyche. One day, walking home from school, they dragged him to a doctor's office, shoved him in front of a human skeleton, and forced him to touch it. Now, for most children, this experience would have been somewhat terrifying, but for young Herman, it was transformative. The fear that the bullies had hoped to inspire turned into a twisted fascination. Rather than be repelled by the macabre, Herman was drawn to it. As a child, Herman was reportedly intelligent, but showed early signs of a darker nature. His fascination with medicine and anatomy led him to experiment with animals. His charm and intelligence later took him to the University of Michigan Medical School, where he began developing the skills that would make him infamous. It was during his time in medical school that Herman learned how to defraud insurance companies, using cadavers to fake deaths and collect payouts. After leaving school, Herman traveled around the country, working as a pharmacist and engaging in various scams. He then went on to settle in Chicago, where he set up a pharmacy, which he acquired by suspicious means after the original owner mysteriously disappeared. But Herman wasn't one to stay still for long, had plans of grandeur. He was no longer content with just running a local drugstore. He had grand designs. He wanted to build something bigger, something more elaborate. He set his sights on a huge 3-story, rundown corner building. He claimed that this building would house a new hotel, complete with shops and apartments for rent. Not having the money to actually purchase this property, let alone the money to renovate and furnish it, Herman would have to use his endless supply of charm and wit to convince investors and creditors to fund his new project. One of the greatest selling points for creditors and investors would be the upcoming Chicago World's Fair. Herman would perfectly time the completion to coincide with the influx of tourists and job seekers. So for those who are not familiar, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, also known as the World's Columbian Exposition, was a landmark event in American history. It was held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, albeit a year late since the actual anniversary was in 1892. The fair became an overwhelming symbol of American innovation and ingenuity. Spread over 600 acres, the fairgrounds were filled with grand buildings, spectacular exhibits, and cutting-edge technology. The main site was in Jackson Park, with the White City being a core part of the fair, named for its grand neoclassical architecture and whitewashed buildings. The fair was a beacon of what the 19th century considered to be the cutting edge of modernity. Some of the highlights included the Ferris wheel. Introduced at the fair, this enormous structure had 36 carriages, and each carriage could hold 60 people, making it a total capacity of 2,160 people per ride. It was designed to rival the Eiffel Tower, which had debuted at the Paris World's Fair just 4 years earlier. The fair was one of the first large-scale public demonstrations of electricity, thanks to George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. The entire fair was lit by electric lights, which astounded visitors. Pavilions from around the world, countries from across the globe set up pavilions to showcase their art, culture, and advancements, providing a glimpse into other worlds for the fair's visitors. Foods and inventions. Many now famous products made their debut here, like juicy fruit gum, cream of wheat, and the iconic Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. Over 27 million people attended the fair over its 6-month run, and it was considered a massive success, signaling Chicago's rise as a cultural and economic hub in the United States after the devastating Great Chicago Fire in 1871. So as you can imagine, this definitely worked in Herman's favor. With investors and creditors on board along with profits he'd made from his pharmacy, the project was a go. Herman hired and fired numerous construction crews. This constant rotation ensured that no one worker ever saw the full plans. Because if you don't know the story thus far, then let me tell you, this wasn't just any hotel. This hotel was filled with oddities, which honestly, I feel that is putting it mildly. Let me explain why. Some staircases led to nowhere, doors that opened to brick walls, trapdoors, and secret passages. Some rooms were soundproof, while others had gas pipes installed, which could be controlled from the outside. He had rooms built with chutes that led directly to the basement, where he kept acid vats, lime pits, and a crematorium. The entire building was designed as a death trap. And why would someone build all of this within their hotel, you may ask? Well, that's because Herman Webster Mudgett is none other than the infamous H.H. Holmes. Now, some of you may know this name well, but if you don't, let me introduce you. H.H. Holmes is one of America's most prolific serial killers. In fact, he is the first ever recorded serial killer in America. H.H. Holmes, originally born Herman Webster Mudgett, changed his name to Dr. Henry Howard Holmes after relocating to Chicago. The new identity served multiple purposes, particularly to distance himself from his shady past, which already included various insurance frauds and business scams. By adopting this name, Holmes found it easier to commit new crimes and avoid detection. Holmes's choice of the name Holmes is thought to have been inspired by the iconic detective Sherlock Holmes, a character created by Arthur Conan Doyle and immensely popular at the time. By aligning himself with a name that evoked intelligence, wit, and a sense of authority, he added an air of legitimacy and respectability to his new persona, which helped him gain the trust of those he would later deceive and kill. He wasn't just borrowing the name, he was crafting an image of a brilliant, capable man, someone others would instinctively trust. Moreover, Holmes was not only adopting the facade of respectability with his new name, but he also had legitimate credentials to back it up. Holmes completed medical school and earned his M.D. from the University of Michigan in 1884. His formal training in medicine added to his ability to manipulate and deceive, as it gave him the authority to conduct medical experiments, sign off on death certificates, and easily gain access to bodies, all of which played into his broader schemes involving insurance fraud and murder. His fascination with anatomy and dissection, nurtured during his medical education, also contributed to the horrifying methods he employed to dispose of his victims. So let's dive deeper. The hotel of H.H. Holmes, which was later dubbed the Murder Castle, was located in the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago, and as I touched on earlier, this was a true architectural nightmare, carefully crafted with one sinister purpose in mind: to trap, torture, and kill. Holmes' charm and intelligence were evident in every detail of this three-story monstrosity, a twisted maze of deception. He had employed a rotating crew of builders, ensuring no one fully understood the blueprint except for him. From the outside, it appeared to be a perfectly ordinary hotel, but within its walls, it was a factory of death. The building was a labyrinth, designed with confusion and control in mind. Many of the rooms were soundproofed, trapping victims' screams within its walls, while some were rigged with airtight seals to suffocate them. Holmes had designed doors that opened only from the outside, meaning once a victim was locked in, they had no chance of escape. Narrow, winding corridors led to dead ends, doors opened into brick walls, and stairways seemed to go nowhere. It was easy to lose your bearings in this structure, and that was exactly what Holmes intended. At the heart of the hotel's horrors were its kill rooms. One of the most infamous methods Holmes used was his gas chambers. Certain rooms were fitted with gas jets, disguised within the walls and ceilings, connected to a control panel in his office. Holmes could turn on the gas and watch his victims suffocate in agony through windows and peepholes to the rooms that he had cleverly installed. He took perverse pleasure in watching their final moments, knowing they were entirely at his mercy. their lives extinguished with the flip of a switch. For those unfortunate enough to survive the gas, the murder castle offered a variety of other grisly fates. Some rooms were equipped with trapdoors that dropped directly into the basement, where a whole new level of horror awaited. Below, Holmes kept acid vats to dissolve bodies, lime pits to strip flesh from bones, and a crematorium to dispose of the remains. He would dissect his victims, selling their skeletons to medical schools or using their bodies for his macabre anatomical experiments. In his medical training, Holmes had developed a keen understanding of anatomy, but instead of healing, he used this knowledge to kill and dismember with clinical precision. There were rooms that served as torture chambers, where Holmes would leave his victims to starve or dehydrate. Other chambers were equipped with iron plates, designed to heat up like ovens, cooking those trapped inside alive. Some rooms had chutes disguised as laundry drops, which Holmes used to quickly transport his victims' lifeless bodies down to the basement, where they would meet their final destruction. Holmes's ingenuity extended beyond just the killing itself. He had escape routes hidden in the walls, secret passageways, and false floors, allowing him to move through the building undetected. This not only let him evade capture, but also helped maintain the mystery surrounding the disappearances, as no one could track his movements once inside the castle. The design of the hotel was as much a psychological trap as it was a physical one. For many of the women who came seeking work or shelter, the grandiose hotel seemed like a safe haven, a place of opportunity amidst the chaos of the World's Fair. Holmes used his charm and charisma to lure them in, making them believe they were safe, only to reveal the true horror of their fate once they were already ensnared in his web. Each room had its own deadly purpose. The more Holmes experimented, the more creative and horrific his methods became. He reveled in the variety of ways he could bring death, whether it was through slow suffocation, poisoning, starvation, or burning. The murder castle was an expression of his twisted genius, a living monument to the darkest depths of human cruelty. Holmes's victims often had no idea what awaited them until it was far too late. Many thought they were entering a regular hotel room, never suspecting the nightmare that was about to unfold. In the end, his castle was a place where life was stolen in the most gruesome, calculated ways imaginable. A house of horrors built for murder, hidden in plain sight. Now you know H.H. Holmes, his intentions, and his murder castle. Let's explore some of his victims. While Holmes confessed to just 27 murders, it is believed that the real number is closer to 200, possibly even more. With 27 million people passing through the Chicago World Fair over the 6 months, that leaves plenty of prey for someone as sinister as Holmes. The women who crossed paths with H.H. Holmes, lovers, wives, and those who trusted him, never knew they were stepping into the orbit of a predator. Their stories, tangled in charm, trust, and deception, end tragically, with letters from loved ones desperately searching for them, often falling into the hands of the man who murdered them. Let's start with Julia Smythe Connor, one of Holmes' earliest victims. Julia wasn't just some passerby. She worked in Holmes's murder castle, and her husband, Ned Connor, ran the jewelry counter in Holmes' pharmacy on the first floor. Julia was married, but her relationship with her husband began to crumble after meeting Holmes. Ned grew suspicious of Julia's growing attachment to the doctor, and soon their marriage unraveled. When Ned finally left, Julia and her young daughter Pearl stayed behind, moving in with Holmes, who by all accounts was having an affair with her. Julia likely thought she had found a future with Holmes. But on Christmas Eve, 1891, both she and her daughter vanished. Holmes later claimed that Julia had died during a botched abortion, but that story was just one of his many lies. The truth was far more sinister. Julia and Pearl were likely murdered in one of the castle's hidden chambers. Pearl, just a little girl, had no chance against Holmes's evil. As for Julia, whether she died in one of his gas chambers or at his hands in another grisly way, we'll never know for certain. But we do know they both disappeared without a trace, joining the ranks of Holmes's many victims who would never see justice. Next came Emmeline Cigrand, a beautiful and ambitious young woman. She arrived in Chicago to work as a stenographer at a company owned by Holmes in 1892. Holmes, as always, turned on the charm, and before long, Emmeline found herself drawn into his web. He promised her marriage, a life of comfort and love. She even sent letters to her friends back home, telling them about the wonderful future she was about to embark on with her handsome, successful suitor. But that bright future never came. By December of that year, Emmeline had disappeared. Her friends received no more letters, and when they inquired, Holmes told them that she had run off to marry someone else. The truth, of course, was much darker. Emmeline was likely asphyxiated in one of his specially designed rooms, perhaps with the gas pipes he had installed to allow him to watch his victims die. Holmes had a way of drawing people to him, and the Williams sisters were no exception. Minnie and Nanny Williams met Holmes in 1893, during the height of his murderous spree. Minnie was a wealthy woman, having inherited a fortune in land from her uncle in Texas. She first met Holmes in Boston, where he introduced himself under yet another alias, Henry Gordon. Drawn in by his magnetic charm and smooth-talking ways, Minnie fell in love with him. She was soon ensnared, agreeing to move to Chicago and even signing over her property to Holmes under the guise of making future business investments. Minnie's sister, Nanny, arrived in Chicago a few months later, unaware of the danger lurking in the castle. Holmes lured Nanny in just as easily, promising her they'd all live together and she'd be able to enjoy her sister's newfound happiness. But in the summer of 1893, both sisters vanished without a trace. Holmes told anyone who inquired that they had left the country for Europe. The truth was far more macabre. Both women were murdered, likely in one of Holmes's hidden chambers, and their bodies were disposed of in his notorious basement. Holmes had a penchant for burning bodies in acid or dissecting them for profit. Their family, worried after not hearing from the sisters, wrote to Holmes, asking about their whereabouts, and in typical Holmes fashion, he strung them along, concocting elaborate stories about the sisters' supposed travels abroad. Then there's Annie Betts, another victim lured in by the prospect of work. Holmes often placed ads in the paper, offering women employment at his hotel, targeting those who came to Chicago during the World's Fair, seeking new opportunities. Annie, eager to make her own way, answered one of these ads. Like so many before her, she was charmed by Holmes. But soon after she entered his hotel, she disappeared. No one ever saw Annie again, and it's likely her end came in one of Holmes' many torture chambers, where he could kill with impunity. Holmes didn't just kill these women. He used their families' grief as an opportunity to further his schemes. When their loved ones began to write letters asking about their missing daughters, sisters, or friends, Holmes would sometimes respond, spinning tales of faraway places, convincing them to send money to help the missing women. He had a twisted way of prolonging the suffering of those left behind, squeezing every last dollar out of their hopes before vanishing. Minnie Williams' inheritance, in particular, became a centerpiece of his con games. After her disappearance, Holmes continued to forge documents and sell off her property, making a small fortune. He even conned some of her family members by pretending she was alive and well, just out of reach. It was all part of his grand scheme, a scheme that often played out in cold letters, giving false hope to desperate families. Holmes had no qualms about profiting off the pain and confusion of those seeking their loved ones. Holmes's ability to manipulate, charm, and deceive these women, along with their families, was unmatched. His hotel, a nightmarish house of horrors, was the perfect setting for his sadistic desires. It was a place where love, trust, and hope turned into death, deception, and misery. Each of these women came into his orbit expecting a future filled with promise, only to meet a grisly fate inside the walls of his architectural monstrosity. In the end, Holmes was a man who not only killed his victims but used their lives and their loved ones' anguish to his financial advantage, draining every bit of hope before snuffing out the lives of those who trusted him most. His victims' stories are haunting not just because of the brutal way they died, but because of the ease with which he betrayed them, using charm as his deadliest weapon. And Benjamin Pitezel's story is one of loyalty, betrayal, and unspeakable tragedy, a twisted irony that only H. Holmes could mastermind. Their relationship began in the late 1880s when Pitezel, a down-on-his-luck carpenter and father of 5, crossed paths with Holmes. Drawn in by Holmes' charm and grand ambitions, Pitezel found himself working on various projects for Holmes, including some of the construction in the infamous Murder Castle. Pitezel, a man in constant pursuit of financial stability, became more than just an employee. He and Holmes formed a bizarre friendship rooted in criminal enterprise. Pitezel was a willing participant in many of Holmes' schemes, including shady business ventures, arson plots, and most fatefully, insurance fraud. While not the sharpest tool in the shed, Pitezel trusted Holmes, perhaps a little too much, believing he could help him provide for his family. But for Holmes, friends were just pawns in his bigger game, and Pitezel was no different. Holmes had cooked up a particularly profitable scam, one that involved faking Pitezel's death to cash in on a $10,000 life insurance policy. The plan was simple. Pitezel would stage his own death, leaving behind a body that could be passed off as his, and Holmes, being the trusted friend, would help his wife, Carrie, collect the money. Holmes assured Pitezel that everything would go smoothly, and Pitezel, likely desperate for a way out of his financial woes, agreed to go along with it. But this was H. Holmes, and trusting him with your life, well, that was never going to end well. Instead of finding a stand-in for Pitezel's fake death, Holmes decided to make it real. In September 1894, in a rented house in Philadelphia, Holmes rendered Pitezel unconscious by giving him a glass of whiskey spiked with chloroform. Once Pitezel was knocked out, Holmes set about staging his accidental death. He covered Pitezel's face with a cloth soaked in chloroform and set fire to the body, making it appear as though Pitezel had tragically died in an explosion. The scene was gruesome and convincing enough for insurance investigators to believe the ruse, and they paid out the policy without question. But the chilling irony of this scam was that Pitezel, the man who was supposed to fake his own death, was in fact quite dead. Holmes, ever the opportunist, didn't hesitate to profit from the situation, not just from the insurance money, but from Pitezel's widow and children. After Benjamin's death, Holmes contacted Carrie Pitezel, assuring her that her husband was still alive, but in hiding as part of their plan. The way Holmes manipulated Carrie is both cunning and heart-wrenching. He told her that she needed to send her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to meet their father, reassuring her they would be reunited soon. Under this false pretense, Carrie allowed Holmes to take her children. He traveled with Alice, Nellie, and Howard across several states, always spinning new lies, keeping them just out of reach of their mother. Tragically, the children never saw their father or their mother again. Instead, Holmes had something far more sinister in store. As they traveled from city to city, Holmes disposed of the children one by one. Little Howard was the first to die. In a chilling display of his cruelty, Holmes killed the boy, dismembered his body, and burned the remains in a stove at a house he had rented in Indianapolis. Alice and Nellie, meanwhile, were kept alive for a little longer, still believing they were on their way to see their father. Holmes eventually murdered both girls in Toronto. He stuffed their bodies into a trunk and locked it, suffocating them to death. To make sure they were never found, he buried the girls' bodies in a shallow grave in the cellar of a rented home. The sadistic irony in all of this is almost unbearable. Benjamin Pitezel had entered into this scam to fake his death, thinking it would set his family up for a better life. But Holmes, true to his nature, turned this twisted plan into a real murder spree, killing not just Benjamin, but his innocent children as well. By the time Carrie Pitezel realized the horrifying truth, it was too late. Holmes had taken her husband, her children, and her trust, leaving her with nothing but grief. In the end, it was this very insurance scam that led to Holmes' downfall. He was arrested in Boston in November 1894, and as authorities dug deeper into his crimes, the full extent of his monstrous deeds was revealed. The bodies of Alice and Nellie were discovered in the Toronto cellar, and the truth about Benjamin's murder came to light. Holmes was ultimately convicted of killing Benjamin Pitezel, but the deaths of the children, along with so many others, solidified his legacy as one of the most cold-blooded murderers in American history. The scam that was supposed to bring the Pitezel family a windfall had instead brought them unimaginable loss, all at the hands of the man they thought they could trust. The tragic irony of Benjamin Pitezel's fate is that his loyalty to Holmes cost him everything. His life, his children, and his family's future, all sacrificed for the greed and cruelty of a man with no limits to his evil. The capture of H. Holmes. In the late autumn of 1894, H. Holmes, the charming yet sinister figure who had evaded justice for far too long, was finally cornered. The tale of his capture begins not with a heroic detective or a slip-up on his part, but rather with the desperate search of a woman who had lost everything, his former accomplice's wife, Carrie Pitezel. After Benjamin Pitezel had mysteriously vanished, Carrie was left with a gut-wrenching uncertainty that clawed at her every day. She knew her husband was mixed up with someone shifty, but she never could have imagined the depths of Holmes's depravity. Carrie was frantic. Her husband hadn't just disappeared. He had vanished without a trace, and their children, who had been left in Holmes's care, were missing too. The last she knew, Benjamin was alive and well, supposedly living in a grand house. But the reality was far darker. Holmes had murdered Benjamin, hoping to cash in on a hefty life insurance policy he'd taken out on him. Fueled by grief and determination, Carrie enlisted the help of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to track down her missing husband and children. As the Pinkertons began their investigation, they quickly discovered that Holmes had a reputation for trickery and deceit. His name became synonymous with crime, and as they followed the trail, it led them straight to Holmes' door in Philadelphia. In November 1894, he was arrested while attempting to escape law enforcement, as he had already begun plotting his next move. When Holmes was captured, it sent shockwaves through the nation. As police began to investigate the infamous murder castle, they found themselves in a horror show of unimaginable proportions. The hotel, built to ensnare victims, became a gruesome playground for the very worst of human nature. Inside, authorities discovered soundproof rooms, hidden chutes, and gas chambers, all designed for one purpose: murder. The details of Holmes' elaborate schemes and the countless young women who had disappeared were enough to make even the staunchest of skeptics believe in pure evil. People were horrified as the truth began to unravel. They recalled the cheerful man who had welcomed them into his hotel, now revealed as a monster. Letters from families searching for their lost loved ones poured in, desperate cries for help that Holmes often turned into opportunities for more deceit. His charm had seduced them, only to cast them into a shadowy void from which there would be no return. The trial began in October 1895, focusing on the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. As the case progressed, it became clear that Holmes had a penchant for spinning webs of lies, and the jury was captivated by his audacity. During the trial, he confessed to the murders of several individuals, admitting to taking their lives with chilling nonchalance. It was almost as if he reveled in the notoriety. In his confession, he wrote a passage that became a famous quote from him. He wrote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing, nor the ambition of an intellectual man to be great. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since. The inclination to murder came to me as naturally as the inspiration to do right comes to the majority of persons. Where others' hearts were touched with pity, mine filled with cruelty, and where in others the feeling was to save life, I reveled in the thoughts of destroying the same. Not only that, I was not satisfied with taking it in the ordinary way. I sought devices strange, fantastical, and even grotesque. It pleased my fancy. It gave me play to work my murderous will, and I reveled in it with the enthusiasm of an alchemist who is hot on the trail of the philosopher's stone. This inclination came to me early in life. I remember when a mere lad my ambition was to study medicine, that I might know the relative effects of poisonous gases, that I might fully become acquainted with their uses, and learn to be an expert in handling them." His words sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the courtroom. He described how his inclination to kill was as natural to him as creativity was to an artist. Holmes claimed that his dark inclinations had been present since childhood, reflecting on how he had always felt a strange allure toward death and destruction. With a face he himself described as having Satan's face, it was as if he embodied the very evil he spoke of. The execution of H. Holmes. On May 7, 1896, Holmes met his fate at Moyamensing Prison, where he was hanged. In those final moments, he exhibited an unsettling calmness, displaying little fear or remorse for his monstrous actions. But his last request was as telling as his crimes. He asked for his coffin to be buried 10 feet deep in concrete, fearing that grave robbers might seek to exploit his body for dissection. When the trapdoor fell beneath him, it was a slow and agonizing death. His neck didn't break as expected. Instead, he strangled slowly, twitching for 15 minutes before he was pronounced dead. The castle itself was damaged by a fire in August 1895. 2 men were seen entering the back of the building at 9 p.m. About half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building and rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Afterward, investigators found a half-empty gas can underneath the back steps of the building. The building survived the fire and remained in use until it was torn down in 1938. The site is currently occupied by the Inglewood branch of the United States Postal Service. In 2017, during allegations Holmes had escaped execution, Holmes's body was exhumed for testing led by Janet Mong of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Due to his coffin being contained in concrete, his body was found to not have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved, and his mustache was found to be intact. The body was positively identified by his teeth as being that of Holmes. He was then reburied. Holmes's story is one of tragedy, betrayal, and horror. It serves as a grim reminder of the evil that can lurk behind a charming smile, a true tale that echoes through the annals of crime history, a dark legend of America's first serial killer. So this is the story of America's first ever serial killer. And while I was doing the research for this story, I found myself questioning Benjamin Pitzel. Although his time with Holmes ended tragically, I questioned if he knew about the murder castle and if he was ever involved in these evil murders. Well, I found I am not the only one to ask this compelling question. It's one that historians and true crime enthusiasts have debated for years. Based on the available information, it seems likely that Benjamin Pitzel didn't know the full extent of H. Holmes's gruesome operations, including the traps, kill rooms, and murder schemes within the murder castle. Pitzel likely saw Holmes as a clever con man and fraudster rather than a serial killer. Pitzel and Holmes worked together on various fraud schemes, insurance scams being the most notorious. Pitzel probably knew about Holmes's fraudulent activities and helped him in several shady business dealings. However, it's doubtful that he was aware of the true horrors happening behind closed doors in Holmes's hotel. Holmes was incredibly secretive about the construction of his hotel, hiring multiple crews to ensure no one person fully understood its sinister design. The trapdoors, gas chambers, and soundproof rooms were carefully hidden from most, and it's likely that Pitzel never saw the full layout of the place or understood its true purpose. To Pitzel, Holmes may have appeared as just a mastermind in the world of scams, rather than the cold-blooded murderer operating in the shadows. It's also important to note that Pitzel was known to have struggled with alcoholism, which Holmes exploited to keep him compliant and somewhat oblivious to his darker deeds. Holmes was a manipulator, and he could have easily kept Pitzel in the dark about the murders while still using him as a pawn in his larger schemes. In Pitzel's mind, they were partners in financial crime, not accomplices in mass murder. The ultimate betrayal, the life insurance scam that led to Pitzel's murder, shows just how little Pitzel truly knew about Holmes. He believed they were faking his death for a payout, unaware that Holmes had planned to kill him for real and take the insurance money for himself. Holmes's willingness to murder Pitzel, someone he worked closely with for years, suggests that Pitzel was just another victim, manipulated and discarded when it suited Holmes' plans. If Pitzel had known about the true scope of Holmes' killing spree, it's hard to believe he would have trusted him enough to stage the fake death plan in the first place. The irony, of course, is that Pitzel thought he was helping Holmes pull off an insurance scam, not realizing that he would actually end up dead, betrayed by the very man he considered a partner. Let me know in the comments what you think of H.H. Holmes and his murder castle. Are you familiar with his story? If you like the story, please help me out by hitting that like button. It really helps to push these videos out.